So, a very warm welcome to the final session of Battle of Ideas 2025. This session's called Europe's Free Speech Crisis, Hyper-Reality. I'm Alistair Donald. I'm one of the conveners of Battle of Ideas Festival this year. We want to look at free speech in Europe in this session, and the thing that springs to mind always, to me this year anyway, was when J.D. Vance went into the Munich Security Conference in February, I think it was, and he said, in Britain and across Europe, free speech is in retreat. Now, leaving aside whatever Vance has done in America, this message delivered to the kind of stony-faced attendees at that conference, I thought was in many ways just such a remarkable speech. The warning that the enemies of free speech were at home rather than external actors such as nefarious Russian or Chinese peddlers of misinformation. So we're all very familiar with the cancel culture, the problems with blasphemy law, press controls, online censorship, and cultural boycotts, I think. But those defenders of many of those things, perhaps not cancel culture, but the others, I think often present themselves as honest brokers, as the defenders of truth-seeking, overcoming hate-filled social fragmentation, creating the required shields for democracy. So they very much present the restrictions on free speech as a means of enabling free speech of other people. So we kind of want to look at that contradiction in this session. Free speech, is it the crisis? Is it hyper-reality? Well, who should we be worrying about? Is it populists with their authoritarian agendas? Is it liberal governments protecting minorities but therefore squashing free speech? Is it NGO complexes and unelected European institutions? And given that I think one of the main reasons for justifying restrictions on speech these days is often this idea of causing harm, of creating mental health problems, then what are some of the arguments that in 2025 we need to create to have a robust defence of free speech in the future? So, to discuss this, I have a panel, excellent panel, I think, from various different parts of Europe. Well, John McGurk on my far right is going to speak first. John's editor of Grips Media, which is Ireland's first and to date only explicitly centre-right news and commentary platform. Also the partner, actually, as it happens, of a Battle of Ideas event taking place in Dublin in November. So if you live in Ireland, then make sure you come along to that one. Secondly, we'll have Jakob Mashangama, who's the Executive Director of the Future of Free Speech. He's a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. FIRE will be known to many of you, and FIRE have been a really important partner for this festival the last couple of years. So welcome, Jacob, to come over from America to be with us. So very pleased about that. Dr. Lola Salem here is a strategist, fundraiser, and scholar in education, philanthropy, and the arts, both in the UK and in France. And one of the things that she spends her time doing just now is as the business development manager at The Critic magazine. If anybody of you know that, it's quite an important and interesting, I think, contribution to the current discussion in the UK. And then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Norman Lewis, who's a visiting research fellow at MCC Brussels, and he's the author of a very interesting and I think quite important report, Manufacturing Misinformation, the EU-funded propaganda war against free speech. So that's who we're going to hear from. So John, if you want to kick us off.
I think this is a fascinating topic. I think when I look around this particular hall, which is the epicenter of British Anglicanism, it makes me think of us in a particular way, all of us in this room. I often think of Robert Aske, the leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, what it must have been like to be a Catholic in the Britain immediately succeeding the English Reformation, where all of your totems, hundreds and hundreds of years of your religion, have just been upended. And criticism of those changes is effectively silenced. Under both Henry VIII and the reign of his eldest daughter, people who criticized the various changes in religion in this country found themselves silenced, sometimes in unimaginably horrific ways. We are fortunate to live in an era where the silencing is no longer quite as unimaginably horrific, but it does have consequences nevertheless. And my thesis, when I think about this as somebody who writes about free speech and thinks about free speech for a living, is that we live in a post-revolutionary society, a society that has undergone a revolution, I think, without many of us noticing it. One of the things that happens in religious revolution or social revolution is that ideas become unchallengeable. And we now live in a Europe where certain ideas are just that. On the national broadcaster in the Republic of Ireland, which is my home country, RTE, it is forbidden, not by criminal law, not by any statute, it is forbidden to question or call into any doubt the science of climate change. Now, that's a very broad attack on free speech, because the science of climate change, as we know, disagrees with itself on many issues, timelines, degrees of harm that will be done, and so on. But what they mean is, in essence, what they mean in practice is that you are not allowed to downplay the threat of climate change on their airwaves. This is a national broadcaster which has enacted that policy, as I say, not because of any legislative feat, but because of a kind of cultural revolution in newsrooms which says that climate change is unchallengeable. And that is a restriction on speech that has a profound democratic effect, but isn't even one that is legally enacted. And you'll find that in newsrooms all across the West. You will find it in newsrooms, for example, in Britain, who will, and I know there are many people at this festival, I've met you all weekend, who are concerned about, the transgender issue. You'll find it in newsrooms across Britain where male persons are described as women for the purposes of having committed sex offences, where the censorship is not being enacted by governmental fiat, but by revolutionary fervour. You'll find it too in newsrooms that refer to, and perhaps this is not so much the case in the UK, but it's certainly the case in my country and many others across Europe, Spain, for example, where the word genocide is applied. We just had a wonderful conversation about genocide in the previous panel. The word genocide is applied to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by newsrooms who have decided to adjudicate a contested fact in one particular direction. So there are three examples of where a kind of cultural revolution has taken place, where the media itself is not self-censoring, because it's eagerly censoring everybody else by applying a particular language, stopping the dissemination of certain ideas, and attempting to move certain ideas beyond the realms of debate altogether. And in that sense, I think our current free speech crisis, which is very real, has all the elements of a kind of religious reformation that has happened, while the rest of us are left sitting here wondering exactly how we got to this place. But the optimistic point, I think, is that when I look around Europe, I look at another thing that is happening, which is what I call the slow death of progressivism, the slow intellectual death of progressivism. Because one of the reasons that you then move from the media self-censoring into the other element of the free speech crisis, which is organizations which are trying to restrict online speech or the attempts to regulate people from saying certain things, is the only people who try to shut down debates are people who are not confident that they can win them, right? Nobody is ever afraid of having a debate that they know they can win, but they're afraid of having debates that they know they can't win. And so we're in this strange environment where we have, right across Europe, we have liberal progressive governments who have adopted progressivism kind of more as a moral pose than an intellectual framework. So these are people who describe themselves as compassionate and good and decent and kind. And they express that through the expression of the moral absolutes I've just described. They are pro-Palestinian, they are trans-inclusive, they are, climate friendly. And these have become kind of shibboleths that they have become intellectually unable to debate. And because they are losing these arguments in many cases, not in every case, but in many cases where they are debated, and because there is now an advancing tide of political parties like Reform in Europe and Reform in the UK, what's happening in Germany, what's happening in France, the entropy of the political centre and its ability to debate has led to this instinct, which is the same as you saw in the religious reformations, of shutting down dissent. We cannot win the argument, so we will close it down. So, how long do I have left, Alistair? So I would leave you with this. We live in an era where intellectually we are ascendant, but politically we are oppressed. And ironically, we are being oppressed because of the power of our intellectual movement. We are the only people who attend events like this. I know we don't all agree on everything, but we are asking the right questions. And when people do not want the correct questions to be asked, because they do not have answers to those questions that stand up. So what I'd say about Europe's free speech crisis is that it is real, but it is more of a symptom of a problem that the political establishment have, which is that they are undergoing a process of entropy, intellectual weakening, and it is the counter movement that is strengthening, which is provoking this crisis. And eventually, I think, like all revolutions that try and clamp down on dissent, the counter revolution will come and wash away what has gone before. That's my optimistic thought that I'll leave you with for now.
Thank you very much, John. I think that was very useful, laying out of the ground. Jacob.
Yes, thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. So I was born and raised in Copenhagen, Denmark, and for much of my life as a young man, I did not really think about free speech. I took it for granted. It was a value that had already been won, it seemed to me, and I was certainly not afraid that religious extremists would be challenging free speech in a very secular liberal country like Denmark. But then 20 years ago, this very year, a Danish newspaper published a number of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, and suddenly Denmark became the epicenter of a global battle of values over the relationship between free speech and religion. Muslim majority states put enormous pressure on Denmark to have the government essentially tell a newspaper what it could and could not publish, to enact blasphemy laws, and even worse, there were terrorist attacks. Editors, journalists had to go into hiding. There were lethal attacks against a free speech debate, and of course, the whole Charlie Hebdo affair with 12 people killed at that famous French satirical magazine partly grew out of the Danish cartoon affair. But I was actually quite proud to live in a country which resisted that coordinated pressure, did not cave in to the pressure from deeply authoritarian theocratic states and those who try to enforce what I call the jihadist veto. But then a couple of years ago, suddenly the Danish government did an about-face after some protesters burned Qurans around the country. Suddenly, the government decided that it was going to introduce a law that would prohibit the desecration of sacred texts, which everyone understood to mean primarily the Quran. And that was a very symbolic moment in time. Denmark had stood up against this jihadist veto, had only a few years before that abolished this blasphemy law, but now suddenly it was willing to appease those it had rejected. Speech, including very much Europe, are contributing to the free speech recession with laws and policies that systematically undermine this precious freedom. And this includes Germany. For instance, in Germany, thousands of Germans have been issues like blasphemy, for instance, the European Court of Human Rights has said that free speech does not protect gratuitously offensive statements about religion. What does gratuitously offensive mean? Well, that, I guess, is very subjective, right? It has also said on the question of hate speech that the convention does not protect hate speech, and it has it doesn't really define what hate speech is. So, as opposed to under the First Amendment, the European Court of Human Rights and that framework of free speech does not protect hate speech. Let me give you an example again from France. A local politician writes something about immigration on his Facebook post. Some people comment on it in terms that are deemed to be anti-Muslim bigotry, criminal under French hate speech laws. Now, the politician, even though he warned people about not using hateful words, was convicted for hate speech under French law, and the European Court of Human Rights said that is not a problem. So, in other words, the free speech recession is actually being entrenched by the very human rights mechanisms that you would think should oppose that. Finally, it's worth mentioning that the European Union at this very time is working to harmonize hate speech across all member states. It is in fact saying that member states do not do enough to criminalize hate speech, and therefore all member states should have a very high bar or a very low bar for restricting hate speech that should be the same throughout all member states that the Commission will then enforce. In fact, Ireland had a bill to adopt a very problematic hate speech bill that collapsed, I guess, due to criticism from within and outside the government. But nonetheless, the European Commission a few weeks or months later wrote a letter to the Irish government saying you are violating your obligations under EU law if you do not criminalize hate speech further. So that is just scratching the surface of the free speech recession in Europe, and which unfortunately also emboldens authoritarian states around the world, because sometimes you will see that they copy-paste European free speech restrictions to justify their own, whereas 50 years ago, Europe was a leader in undermining communist states by using free speech as a competitive advantage against authoritarian states. But now the prevailing wisdom in Europe seems to be that free speech is this Trojan horse which allows the enemies of democracies, both within and without, to undermine it. And that, I think, is a profoundly misguided and dangerous development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. It's quite useful to go through all the different countries and see many similar problems on the horizon. Lola.
I've spoken on many panels this year, the Battle of Ideas, and this is the first one I felt I needed to write a few things. One of the reasons is that I'm not a legal philosopher or a lawyer for that matter. And I'm very grateful for Dr. Sam Boris from the Prosperity Institute for the recent refresher that I took on the topic. As you can hear, I'm French. I've been living in this country for many years. And it strikes me that the freedom of speech debate, to me at least, feels like a very Anglo-American conversation. One of the core reasons for this is that there is a fundamental difference in terms of constitutional traditions from this side of the channel to the other side of the channel. And the UK and the US, technically speaking, are supposed to be those liberty-loving nations with an ancient constitution, at least in the case of the UK. Whether the UK lives up to that tradition is another matter. I'll come back to this in a minute. But this is a different framework than the one I know from experience in France and from the rest of Europe. Montesquieu, in 1748, was defining England as the one nation in the world whose constitution has political liberties for its direct purpose. I think it bleeds into the fairly common cliche, which is that technically, or at least in theory, in this country, British common law means that everything is permissible unless specified otherwise, unless forbidden. And contrary to this in France, for example, but I think in the rest of the EU also, everything is illegal until it is made legal by the state. this is one of the fundamental principles at work in the constitutional principles in the UK, or in the US, and in Europe, which is fundamentally different. And so that built heritage in the UK is one of the reasons actually I love very, very, very much the UK. And I think we can fight the good fight here better and maybe more easily than in Europe. But again, those constitutional ideas are built on a almost unbroken thread that goes from the Magna Carta up to today. And people, for example, from Alfred the Great, Addison, William Marshall, John Fortescue, Edward Coke, John Selden, etc., could talk also about philosophers like Locke and Hume and Mills, etc., are people who have not codified the way that freedom of speech sits in the EU and the way that French people, as in my case, or Europeans think of these matters. And I think we can maybe discuss later if the UK has unlearned and abandoned its own tradition, but in terms of how it has bled into the European institutions in the way that people expect the state and the laws to behave, those are fundamental differences, in my opinion. The Napoleonic Code that basically still shapes French legal system, and I think is basically a blueprint for shaping the rest of civil law across Europe, and especially also EU institutions based in Brussels and elsewhere, was thought out in the early 19th century as a way to curtail freedoms, and especially to enforce a form of censorship that did not exist before. I think that, again, this form of codification in the law that is fundamentally different from the jurisprudence at work, the customs and traditions at work in British common law, means that for a European, it is very difficult to understand those questions of freedom of speech from the point of view of the institutions, but also from the habit and just the general mainstream discourse. To take a personal example, I don't think my own parents, who I don't think are politically misinformed in any sort of way, believes that there is a freedom of speech issue at all. I think they received the speech from G.D. Vance, which I personally liked very, very much, but they didn't really see what he was talking about. There is, for many people in Europe, a non-problem about those things. And so just to finish on that note about what is also happening to the UK in terms of crisis of freedom of speech, I think that in part it is to do with the fact that EU law or sort of the legal philosophy that is entrenched in the Napoli Code or in Brussels legislation is sort of bleeding into the UK. The Equality Act, for example, feels much more European, legally speaking, than British. And I think that part of the sort of byproduct of continental law is the fact, for example, that we conflate or we don't understand anymore the distinction between opinions and beliefs. So I'll finish on this.
No, thank you very much. It's interesting that it takes someone who's French, and actually a lot of the time Jacob as well, who's Danish, to come here and remind us of some of the great traditions that emerged around free speech in this country. It was something that we could maybe look at in the discussion: is have we unlearned them, or have they been reinterpreted? How does that work? Norman, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. Well, hyper reality, I think whoever posed this question is living in a parallel universe. There is a major crisis of free speech in Europe. Did you know that in the last maybe 8 years, the EU as an institution has poured 650 million euros into about 350 projects that deal with hate speech and disinformation, basically to control what can and cannot be said in Europe. Hundreds of NGOs, university departments, research institutes are being funded by the EU, basically to police speech in Europe. The European Union now spends more money policing speech than they do on cancer research. That's how serious they take it. And that's how gullible and silly many of us have been, and naive about what is actually going on here. There's been a systematic attempt in the last decade or so to recalibrate the language of free speech and the language that we use to discuss politics in Europe. You take something like the Digital Services Act, which is the kind of backbone of the whole censorious legal framework that the EU Commission has developed. This is the act that enables the EU to determine, to tell big tech, the social media companies, what can and cannot be said published on online. That if they don't take stuff down that they regard, that the EU Commission regard as hate speech or disinformation, they will be fined up to 6% of their global revenues, even though those global revenues might be anyway. The point there is that this is an act. Now, if you just think about the language, and I really want you to consider this, we've had quite a few of this discussion in lots of other panels about the use of language today and how important this is for the future. The Digital Services Act. Services. What this act is a surveillance act. It's a speech act. It's an anti-speech act, but it's called the Digital Services Act. And so they present this. Speech is now being presented in Europe as a commodity delivered conditionally rather than as a political right, as an inalienable right of citizens across Europe. The citizen has become an end user. Dissent and anything deemed dangerous becomes a risk factor to be managed. Regulating speech, censorship is no longer a political tool, but a technical means of service optimization. You can see how good I'm becoming at the kind of Orwellian newspeak that the EU are so brilliant at. They are really, truly remarkable. And I think it's a really important point to grasp that what is really happening here is that the public square in Europe is being turned into like a utility grid, one that can be switched off whenever Brussels decides that the current is too strong. Not you or me, but they determine. That's the whole point about the whole hate speech discussion, is that who determines what is hate speech? Who determines what's disinformation? And they are monopolizing that through these laws and through the system that they have created, where they are funding these unaccountable NGOs and university departments, backed up by the courts in the way that has been expressed, to basically police what can and cannot be said. And I just want to draw your attention to one project that really shocked me, and it will be part of a new report that MCC Brussels is bringing out shortly on the Democracy Shield, and that's the concept of pre-bunking. A lot of these projects that I'm talking about are looking at how AI can be applied to spot and take down hate speech when it appears online. So it's developing taxonomies and all of this. Pre-bunking is to anticipate language and concepts that could be considered to be hate speech or disinformation before they're published. So when these words appear, there will be AI algorithms that will either take it down or put counter arguments to this before they actually can become spread to the public. You know who's behind this? Google. It's very interesting. Google and one of the fact checkers in the European fact-checking standards network, which you should go and look at. It's extraordinary. This is one of these NGO types that are both funded by the EU and who are now, you have got this sole responsibility to decide what is the truth and what is a fact and what is misinformation. They are developing a pre-bunking system that essentially pathologizes dissent. Anybody who opposes what the EU stands for, whether it's on the Green Deal, whether it's to do with immigration, whether it's to do with defense or energy policy, now is being criminalized by essentially suggesting that this is disinformation. And this is part of the other element of this which we should really take into account, which is this narrative that has developed alongside the DSA and misinformation, disinformation, is this foreign information manipulation and intervention, what's called FIMI. Because what they are presenting through this narrative is that all dissent essentially is being driven by disinformation. So when the farmers took to the streets against the Green Deal, this wasn't because the farmers had a genuine grievance against the EU, that perhaps, the Green Deal was impacting their living standards and the future of farming in Europe. No, this is because the Russian bots and foreign intervention and manipulation of information was making people believe that this was the case. In other words, it's a narrative that sees the European people, the demos, as the problem, as being, uneducated, don't have the sophistication of the elite in Brussels and the bureaucrats who can spot disinformation.
Hang on a minute.
And through this are able to manipulate people into acting against the EU itself. And I think we really have to sit back and wake up and smell the coffee about what's going on here, because they're about to launch a new initiative called the Democracy Shield, which is going to bring this all together, including state intelligence services. And if you want to understand how this works, I'll give you one example. The Romanian elections that took place in 2024. The EU is a great enthusiastic backer of democracy, as they like to tell us. They are there to defend democracy, except, of course, when the democratic vote produces the wrong result. Then they move into action, because what happened in Romania was that this right-wing, far-right candidate came in and looked like he won the first round and he was going to win the second round. What did they do? The courts that had agreed to the election process annulled the election. And this was based upon information that the NGOs that the EU was funding was feeding to the authority, and it resulted in the election being annulled. They then rerun it and got the right result. And that's my point. The point really is that the democracy shield
final point,
is not a shield to defend democracy. It's a shield to defend the EU Commission, who itself is unelected, from the electorate itself. It's a shield against democracy. And if we don't wake up to this, I would suggest that free speech no longer exists in Europe. We've got a real big battle on our hands. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.